Hey guys, we're getting ready to start Chapter 7, Lesson 2, our last lesson for Chapter 7. And here we're going to start on page 188, up here where it says many nations go through a demographic transition, and we're going to end on page 197 where it says checkpoint questions. Alright, and that's going to be at the end of the chapter. Now, our study tip today is going to be to read information out loud to yourself as you study. Now, this may seem silly at first, but reading out loud means that you're mentally storing information in two ways. You're seeing it or you're reading it, and you're hearing it. And we all know how easy it is to remember a contagious song or stuff that we like to sing. So if you read things out loud to yourself, that's going to help you a lot in terms of training your brain to remember things. Alright, so let's get started on the theory of demographic transition. Now, this theory states that as a country moves from a subsistence economy to industrialization and increased affluence, it undergoes a predictable shift in population growth. Okay, now there's 4 phases. We're going to talk about each one, and there's 3 factors that we measure, and that's birth rate, death rate, and population size. Now, this is not a perfect graph. Every single country doesn't fit into it perfectly, but there are some trends and there are some exceptions that you can absolutely read about as soon as we're done here. Alright, and so here's our demographic transition. We have phase 1, 2, 3, 4. We have birth rate is our blue line, death rate is our red line, and population size is purple. Alright, so let's talk about the 4 phases. Phase 1 is going to be slow growth. Let's see if I can have, oh, nice, I can have them both in the picture at the same time. So phase 1 is the slow growth. We have a really high birth rate and a high death rate, which means that our crude birth rate and crude death rate are approximately even. This is usually a pre-modern society, so pretty primitive still. We have a low life expectancy and a high infant mortality rate, and that's due to disease, lack of health care, poor sanitation, kind of some of the stuff that we were talking about yesterday. Now, in these kinds of societies, these subsistence societies where basically you grow and you raise the food that your family eats, more children is better. Okay, the children can work on the farms, they can pass along strong genes, and they can care for parents. Usually these are countries that don't have things like Social Security, and you have to rely on your children to take care of you when you're old. Okay, my example is Lesotho in Africa. It's a country on the eastern southern part of Africa, and they're kind of still in demographic transition phase 1. Alright, phase 2 is going to be rapid growth, and we're going to have a high birth rate, but the death rate has actually started to decrease. Okay, which gives us this rapid growth because we're having more and more babies and not as many people are dying as they used to die in phase 1. Okay, now this is kind of the modernization stage where we're increasing our sanitation, access to clean water is increasing, access to food and health care is increasing, and all of those factors are working together in order to decrease the death rate. Now, the birth rate is still high due to our friend population momentum.
Ramos, please report to the library.
And yesterday we talked about population momentum and the fact that it takes a country or a community a long time to realize that not as many people or children or infants are dying, so they're still reproducing at the rate that they're used to. It just hasn't quite gotten through their heads that, okay guys, it's time to settle down. We don't need as many babies as we did before because we have all these great modernization benefits. Okay, now my example is India. They're still growing at an exponential rate. They have their population pyramid. Okay, it's absolutely the pyramid shape, and so their population is increasing very rapidly. In fact, India is the second largest population in the world, but demographers are kind of theorizing that India is going to surpass China because of China's one-child policy. All right, next we have phase 3, which is stable growth. This is what happens when there's an increase in the economy or the money and an increase in the education. And so what's going to happen at that time is there's going to be an increase in income per family. Like each family is going to have more money. And so usually when that happens, there's a decrease in the number of children. Now, the reasoning behind that is that babies become a financial burden rather than a benefit like they were in phase one. So in phase one, we wanted to have a lot of babies so that we could have enough people to work on the farm. In phase three, we don't want to have a lot of babies because then we have to buy them all the cool stuff that all their friends have, and they're going to eat more and they're going to consume more and things like that. During phase three, there's a lower birth rate and a lower death rate because kind of population momentum has caught up with us and we realize that we don't have to reproduce as much. Crude birth rate is again approximately equal to crude death rate. There's usually an emphasis on small families due to birth control, jobs, and education. My example of phase three countries are the United States and Canada. We're still increasing, but we're definitely not by very much. Now here is a cool graph talking about total fertility rate versus per capita income. So we can see that as total fertility rate is going to be decreasing as our per capita income increases. Okay, so it looks like the average per capita income of the United States is about $45,000, and our total fertility rate is 2.1.
Ms. Ramos, please report to the library.
And so we can see that we kind of fall along this line. Okay, there's going to be lower income and bigger families up here like Niger and Afghanistan, and smaller families with higher income in like Luxembourg, which is in Germany. All right, our last one is going to be phase four, which is actually a declining growth phase. Okay, so there's an increase in affluence and economy. If you don't know what affluence is, that's okay. Stay tuned. We're going to talk about it today. There's not very many young people, and there's a lot of old people in countries like this. So what happens is it's not always the best thing ever, because not having enough young people to be working in the economy, and there's more retired people, means that there's going to be a higher tax burden on each worker in the form of things like Social Security. So for example, my generation, as almost a 30-year-old person, Social Security might not be around when I am old enough to receive it because it might have already run out, because our population is pretty stable and might go towards decreasing, so there might not be enough workers in the economy to support me as a retired person. So I'm going to have to save my money now in order to make sure that I have enough to live when I retire. All right, now at this point, some governments encourage immigration and reproduction, like Japan encourages reproduction on their citizens. My examples of phase four countries are Japan, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Russia. All right, so they're actually moving towards phase four in the United States, and Norway, Italy. We saw the other day that Italy has zero population growth, so they're going to move towards this declining growth pretty soon. All right. Next we have family planning, and I actually want to put this. All right. Family planning, which is the regulation of the number or spacing of offspring through birth control. And so birth control can take on many different forms. You probably learned a lot about it in health class. All right, and it can be either female or male birth control. Now, demographers have kind of seen these trends where an increase in affluence and female education leads to a decrease in total fertility rate. And now what I really love is this graph down here where it talks about the education of women based on their, and then the resulting total fertility rate. So in Ethiopia, women with no education have 6.1 babies on average, while women with secondary, which is high school, or higher education, which is college, have only 2. Okay, so if you can notice, we're kind of chilling 2 to 3 right here in the educated women, and here we're going, 4 to 6. Okay, so there's a substantial difference in educated and uneducated women as far as how many babies they have. Now, usually an increase in education means that women wait longer to have kids, and so that can like I haven't had any babies yet, and I'm already 27, and so I have a much shorter amount of time right now between the time I'm 27 and by the time I'm 35, which is about the time you should stop having kids. So I have a much shorter window, so I don't really have even the capability to have 6 kids at this time because I waited too long. Now, another thing is that educated women have a lot of knowledge about birth control options, and I can find, as an educated woman, I can find what's going to work for me, and both of those factors work together to decrease the number of babies that we're going to have. All right, now there's government campaigns all over the world that kind of preach to their citizens about what kind of problems overpopulation produces, not only in the environment but in the economy. Like usually overpopulation leads to a high number of unemployed people, and that can be bad. And they also, a lot of government campaigns support like condoms and things, and so they have their own way to get their citizens to make good choices about reproduction. All right, now we're going to talk about population size and consumption and how they interact with the environment. All right, so we have economic development. So as far as the economy is concerned, you're either in a developed or you're in a developing country. Right, those are kind of your two options. In developed countries, you have a low growth rate. In developing countries, you have a high population growth rate. It's been estimated that approximately 1/5 of the human population lives in developed countries, and 4/5 of the population lives in developing countries. However, they both use about half of the world's resources. So as you can see, the developed nations people are using a lot more resources per person than the developing countries. All right? Usually developed countries have 2 to 10 times the environmental impact, especially per person. Okay? Now, affluence, that word from before, is going to be the money, goods, or property of a person or a nation. So you can have affluence as a person, and you can have affluence as a nation. And the affluence kind of talks about and kind of gets into exactly what your environmental or ecological footprint is going to look like. So I've given us 3 examples here of ecological footprints. Per capita, Haiti has only a half a hectare. Okay, so that's not very much at all. China, 1.8. Okay, and then United States is a whopping 9 hectares per person. Okay, now the United States is more than 5 times the environmental impact of a person living in China and 18 times that of a person living in Haiti. All right, so we're going to talk a lot about affluence and how we can reduce our impact on the world as we go through this class. But I think it's really important to notice just kind of these trends about where you live and why it matters and what we can do to kind of limit ourselves, okay, without limiting our standard of living. All right, now there's some environmental scientists that came up with this thing called the IPAT equation. Now, it looks like an equation because it has an equal sign and a multiplication sign and stuff like that, but it's actually just a conceptual representation of the 3 major factors that influence the environmental impact. So it's called the IPAT because it's I equals PAT. Impact equals population times affluence times tech. Now, there's not going to be real numbers for really of any of these except for like population, and I mean, maybe you can call affluence like GDP or something, but there's not going to really be a number for technology. So this is a conceptual thing, guys, okay? Not an actual math equation. So let's talk about what all of these things mean. Right? So impact. Impact is going to be our environmental impact, okay, which is determined by the population. Is generally the increase in population means an increase in the use of resources, especially in developed versus developing countries like we just talked about. Affluence, the general trend is an influence in affluence leads to an increased an increased affluence leads to an increased impact, okay, just like developed versus developing countries. Again, developed countries have way higher affluence, and so they have a much higher impact like we just saw. And then the last one is going to be technology. There are some technology that's bad. For example, CFCs was a compound that we created to use for refrigerators. It was really cheap and effective way to refrigerate and use in air conditioners and stuff like that. However, it caused a hole in the ozone layer, so that's kind of bad technology. But then we also have some good technology like hybrid cars, or the green things that you think about whenever anyone says go green. Okay, so there's going to be good technology and bad, so that might bring that conceptual number higher or lower. Okay, so we want to keep our impact as low as possible, both as an individual and then as a nation. All right, now these environmental impacts can take many different forms. They can be local or global. So my first local example here is deforested land in Brazil can cause erosion, soil degradation, and habitat loss. This is done from clear cutting. So most developing countries use local materials. They can't really afford to import things. Now, on the plus side, that's good for their economy, but on the negative side, it leads to overuse, kind of like what we were talking about in Chapter 3, opening story, about how in Haiti they had chopped down so many trees to make charcoal that they didn't have enough anymore, and they had to move to coal and all sorts of crazy stuff. So if you need a review, you can go back and look at that. Now that can lead to overused resources. The most used resources at a local level is the land, of course, and then woody biomass, trees, shrubs, anything with wood. And then finally, agriculture leads to, or the clearing the land for agriculture leads to erosion, soil degradation, and habitat loss. Then once you start putting fertilizer on it, it can lead to water pollution. So the moral of the story is, if you're in Brazil and you live in the Amazon rainforest, don't clear cut it to grow corn. Like, corn's not supposed to grow in the Amazon. Okay, lots of species are supposed to grow in the Amazon, but corn is not one of them. Okay. Next we have global environmental impacts. Again, of course, we want to talk about agriculture. We're going to be talking about agriculture a lot. Agriculture decreases the carbon dioxide uptake by plants, because when you clear a forest to grow plants that are only as tall as a person, it's definitely going to leave a bunch of carbon dioxide in the air. So we're going to increase the greenhouse gases through that. Also, bringing in all the big trucks to cut down the trees, and then having it in the tractors, they're going to emit greenhouse gases as well. Another global environmental impact comes from affluence and suburbia. So suburban areas are the outlying areas to a city. These people can afford to import things. We can go to Pier 1, or we can go to Walmart and get stuff that was made in China. Okay, we also seem to enjoy green lawns, which is basically a gigantic resource hole that just sucks in a bunch of water, fertilizer, pesticides, all kinds of stuff. Not sure who invented lawns, but especially in places like California or Los Vegas, lawns can be a huge waste of a lot of resources. Right, then we have fossil fuels for transport. You can drive to work, you drive to the grocery store. The peaches that you just ate had to drive up from Mexico to meet you. Okay, there's a bunch of fossil fuels. Okay, and now on the bright side, we also have sewage treatment, which treats water and makes water available to everyone, and makes it clean. So when it goes back into the water system, it's clean. And then we have MSW collection. MSW is municipal solid waste, and that way there's not trash kind of polluting the streets. Now there still is somewhere, and some places are more trashy and dirty than others, but in general, we have the ability to throw our trash away. Just sometimes we don't, for whatever reason. All right, now urban environmental impacts are kind of their own special group. An urban area is anything that has more than 386 people per square kilometer, or 1,000 people per square mile. Urban people are approximately half the population of the world and consume about 3/4 of the resources. Okay. Now, they're also the percent of the population living in cities is going up, especially in developing countries. People want to get jobs at factories and things like that, and that's bringing people into the cities. Now, practices that happen in urban environments that increase the environmental impact are there's a lot of concentrated solid waste. That's trash. Okay, solid waste is trash. So there's more trash in cities than there's in the country. There's more pollution, especially carbon dioxide gas, land use, building buildings and things like that. There's not a whole lot of space that's left for parks or other natural areas, and concrete, which basically prevents a lot of the water from getting to the natural sources. We'll talk about that a little bit in chapter 9 and chapter 14. Now, some good things that kind of lower the environmental impact is that people that live in cities actually have a lower ecological footprint than those people who live in suburban areas, mostly due to public transit and that services are in walking distance, so they don't have to, go drive 20 minutes to go into their favorite grocery store. Okay, there's usually one right around the corner. All right, two things left. First is going to be gross domestic product, which is kind of this impact of affluence that we're going to talk about. So gross domestic product is the value of all products and services produced in a year in that country. All right, and there's 4 types of economic activity. There's consumer spending, so like me and you going to the store. There's government spending, like what are we going to spend our country's money on, and that kind of depends upon the president. Investments, which is how a lot of people, especially people who have surplus money, they put it into investments. And then exports versus imports, or exports minus imports. Right now, in general, like especially through phase 1 and phase 2 of the demographic transition, an increase in GDP leads to an increase in pollution, because as soon as we get out of like that agriculture kind of phase, then we're going to start building factories, start having more cars. It's actually going to increase pollution. That's kind of where China is at this time. But then they've kind of noticed this kind of turning point in GDP where you hit a certain higher GDP. Once you hit that turning point, you actually have more money and more research about investing in things like clean energy and using your technology to burn fossil fuels more cleanly, more efficiently. And so it kind of goes up, your pollution, and then comes back down. So it's kind of like a bell curve where, as an agriculture or hunting and gathering community, you have almost no pollution. And then you go way, way up when you're just industrializing. And then you come back down and, you work towards saving money and saving the air, okay, or your environment. Our last sticky note today is going to be sustainable development. Now, sustainable development strives to increase standards of living without causing environmental harm. So everyone wants to live a good and comfortable life, but sometimes that means that we sacrifice the health of our environment in order to do that. Okay. Now, I think it was 2005. Yeah, 2005. There was something called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Project. All right, and they had 3 conclusions that I've kind of summarized here for us. And it says that there's a lower sustainability if the human population and consumption are increasing. So as human population and consumption increases, sustainability decreases. So you can't do that forever. All right. Then their second conclusion is that the increase in well-being for some leads to a decrease in well-being or poverty for other people. All right. So it's kind of the good of the few versus the good of the whole. All right, and you can kind of see that even in the United States. We have a very small population of super rich people and then a very large population of poor people, right? Because it's kind of imbalanced. It's not balanced at all. And our last conclusion is that sustainable practices lead to an increase of standard of living for all people. All right, so rather than just kind of cater to those few people, we want to cater to everyone, and that's kind of what sustainability is all about. Right? And so I'm going to end you with the quote from that project, and they said that human actions are depleting Earth's natural capital, putting such strain on the environment that the ability of the planet's ecosystems to sustain future generations can no longer be taken for granted. All right, so that's why we're taking this class. That's why we're learning all these things, and that's why we're going to make positive decisions as we grow older. All right, I'll see you tomorrow.